Hello everyone, we're now in Lesson 3, Asia Pacific from Miracle to Mirage. Now let's look at the readings for this week. After last 2 weeks when we looked at the big picture of globalization and transnational corporations, we're now moving into the region of Asia. Asia has seen some phenomenal economic growth since the end of the Second World War, and these are the readings that we're going to do this week. The first is from Cohen and Kennedy's book, Global Sociology. This gives you some understanding about Asia Pacific as a region, what it has seen in the 20th century, what are its prospects in the 21st century, and so on. And then we're going to read a very important article by Professor Ha-Jun Chang from University of Cambridge. This is a chapter, an article, Korea, the Misunderstood Crisis in World Development. Now this paper looks at the Asian financial crisis in a very critical way. Let's look at the topics that we're going to cover this week. The first topic is the phenomenal economic growth in East Asia. Now, East Asia as a region has experienced some tremendous economic growth since the end of the Second World War. That is 1945. Now, since that period, this region has seen some of the poorest countries in the world becoming the largest economic powers in the world. The first country that has joined the ranks of advanced industrialized nations from this region is Japan, the first Asia's giant. Now, since Japan's phenomenal economic growth since the end of the Second World War, we have seen 4 Asian tigers that came about following some of the similar industrial strategies of Japan. These countries include South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Now, these 4 countries or 4 economies have also experienced tremendous economic growth against all odds. Now, when we look at these countries nowadays, it's hard to imagine that these countries were once poor, very small economies in East Asia. Nobody thought these countries had much hope. In most of these cases, they had relatively very little natural resources. They had very little capital to begin with. So these were not countries that people thought were the emerging powers. But now, these countries have become some of the largest industrial nations in the world. They produce many of the goods that the world enjoys. They're major trading countries. So we have seen, since Japan, 4 Asian tigers, all from East Asia. And then recently, we have been witnessing the tremendous, dramatic economic development of China, the next major giant coming from Asia. So we want to look at Asia as a whole, trying to understand what has transpired in this region. What were some of the challenges that these countries faced in the region? What are some of the learnings that took place in the region that helped some of these countries come about in terms of economic development using sometimes quite similar strategy, in particular export-oriented industrialization? And then we're going to look at how globalization and transnational corporations also affected this region. How have transnational corporations found East Asia as a region? At first, before a long time ago, the countries in East Asia or Asia were not seen as prime candidates for development. So many of the transnational corporations were much more interested in investing in countries in Latin America where there was a large populace, but also a lot of natural resources. So what is the relationship between transnational corporations and countries in Asia? We want to see how globalization since the end of the 1980s, 1990s has affected this region and how the countries in this region has affected the process of globalization. And then we're going to look at the Asian financial crisis from 1997. Now, how has the Asian financial crisis affected this region? Is this the end of this region's phenomenal economic growth? Are some of the questions that we're going to ask. The concepts, let me recap, are economic growth. We want to compare economic growth and economic development. Scholars talk about economic growth as just the size of the economy growing without perhaps some structural transformation from moving from agrarian to industrial economies and so on. That is included in the concept of economic development. So we're going to contrast the concept of development versus growth. And then we're going to discover concepts like 4 Asian tigers. They're also called the Gang of 4, 4 mini dragons, vis-a-vis the larger dragons in the region and so on. So we're going to visit the issues of 4 Asian tigers. What are these economies like? How do they come about in terms of economic growth and so on? We're going to visit concepts like the developmental state. The state has been a critical component of economic development in this region. So we're going to visit the concept of developmental state to understand how a government can play an active role in a country's economic development. And then we're going to visit the Asian financial crisis that spelled doom for the region as a whole. But like a phoenix, this region rose after the Asian financial crisis, some countries even stronger after the financial crisis. So by reading Professor Chang's article, we're going to understand how the Asian financial crisis affected this region, how countries in this region have overcome the financial crisis. Now this is lesson 3, and I'll see you next week.